Good afternoon, colleagues. So yeah, this is the last session of the day today, so let's get on with it, and then we can do some exciting stuff afterwards. Okay? So I have an esteemed panel here, 3 professors. So today we are really going to get educated about inflation targeting in South Africa and what we need to do about it. So we have Professor Stephen Hall, and then we have Professor Philippe Berger, and then Professor Nicola Viegi. So the bios of the presenters are in the program, and so I'm not going to try to introduce them. Instead, I would actually want us to go on with the business of the day. So Professor Stephen Hall, if you could give us your talk, and then we can go in that order. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I was actually asked to do this paper by Felipe about 6 months ago as part of a UN-wider project. I'm glad to say that the paper is completed and on their discussion paper website. So if you want to read it in detail, it's there. So the paper's an optimal inflation rate for South Africa, which, let's face it, that's what we're all here for. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay, so where did the current dominant 2% come from? Well, the answer to that is it was pretty much made up by the New Zealanders, and everybody's copied it ever since. They had no real argument for 2%, but it seemed a nice number. And the world has sort of got stuck with it. The question then is, should everybody converge on 2%, or just what should it be? Well, I think when Felipe asked me to do this paper, I know he knew that I'm an economic modeler and econometrician, and I think he expected an economic model. Yeah. Well, I disappointed him. There's a bit of econometrics in the full paper. I'm not going to even mention that today. And there's no model as such which comes out with an optimal inflation rate. What I first started to do was to look around and see what economic theory, economic literature actually had to say. And I came across this paper from the head of research at the Washington Fed, Direx. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, but I think it's something like that. What this graph is showing is, on the vertical axis, the number of papers that have been written and came out with a particular optimal inflation rate. So the big column there with about 60 papers recommending a 0 inflation rate as optimal. Quite a few on the negative side, suggesting the inflation should actually be negative. And then a very few on the right-hand side, and none really around 2%, although there are a couple in the very latest literature. Now, there's a dimension which that figure doesn't show, which is a sort of when the papers were written dimension. And most of the ones with a negative, and most of the ones with a negative inflation rate were the earlier papers, and the most recent ones have at least come out with a positive inflation rate as optimal. So I thought there's not much point adding another model to that. Let's try and understand just what it is that moves what's obviously either 0 or a negative optimal inflation rate to one which is actually positive and sensible. Now, I have a very strong prejudice about these things. There's a contradiction here. Most studies recommend a 0 or negative inflation rate, and yet not a single central bank in the world has adopted anything like that. When I see that, I tend to assume that it's the economists and the economic theory and modelers that are wrong. And so, sensible people do sensible things on the whole, and that's what I decided is the issue here. So most of these studies must be missing at least one important thing, if not a whole bunch of things. And so that's really what this paper is all about. It's all the things you need to think about when you're talking about an optimal or ideal inflation rate. And there's quite a lot of them, it turns out, when I start to go through them. I need this because I can't actually see the screen down there. I don't see very well. Okay. The first and most obvious is what's quite well known in the literature as the Friedman rule. And the idea of this, it's a really stupid model, if you ask me, but Milton's very famous, so there's not much I can do about that. But the basic idea of the Friedman rule is that you should use as much money as possible because it's very cheap to create money, and so let's assume there's a zero cost in creating money, which is almost true anyway, that you should just get people to use as much money as they need, which means the nominal interest rate, think of the standard money demand function you get in textbooks, should be zero, which is when people use as much money as possible. Now that starts to give you some pretty stupid answers. If it means that if the R star, the long-run real rate of interest, is say 1%, then for the nominal interest rate to be 0%, you need minus 1% inflation. The only place that actually makes any sense with the Friedman rule is if everything's zero, so you have zero nominal rates, zero R star, and zero inflation. But you can't get anything other than that out of this sort of model. So then if you start looking through the literature in general, there's quite a lot of early literature from people like Barrow, who are looking essentially at whether low inflation is good for an economy. They were pretty naive econometric studies. They simply fitted a linear curve to a whole bunch of economies, and they looked to see if that was a downward sloping curve, so that the lower inflation is, the higher the growth rate is. But there's very robust evidence that that is in fact the case. Low inflation is good for growth, at least in the medium term. Whether it's good for growth in the current quarter or not, you can argue about that, but over a long period of time, it's clearly a good thing. But that was a linear relationship, and most of their data was looking at economies with inflation with, say, 5% upwards. So they had very few observations of really low inflation. And you sort of imagine intuitively it should be a non-linear curve. You're not saying that growth would keep improving as you get negative inflation and more negative inflation, but that's effectively the implication of this sort of analysis. So you can't extrapolate from what was a bunch of countries with, say, 5 to 20% inflation going down even further than that. The normal argument that central bankers would make for having a bit of inflation is the downward nominal rigidity one, especially with respect to wages. Now that's fairly obvious. People don't like to have their wages cut, but a bit of inflation allows for that to happen over time in real wage terms. And that's true also of lots of other prices. You might want to reduce a particular sector's price or a particular goods price. And it's much easier to do that in real terms if you've got a bit of inflation going on. And I think one of the earlier speakers actually mentioned the greasing the wheel of the economy sort of idea, and that's very standard. Another good reason, and I think I'd hate to use the term emerging markets after the last talk, but I think for many emerging markets, they like to have quite a high inflation target simply because of the benefits to the fiscal side of an inflation tax. I work a lot with the Bank of Greece, and for a long time before Greece joined the Euro system, it clearly funded most of its government expenditure through the inflation tax. It means you can expand government public debt quite a lot very easily while keeping the debt to GDP ratio constant, and printing money allows governments to simply fund their expenditure directly. And there are arguments for that. An incomplete tax system is a good argument for an inflation tax, because obviously if there's a large informal sector of the economy that you can't really tax in the usual way, then having an inflation tax actually does take some resources from that. But it's not a very good way of setting up a tax system. It's largely a regressive tax. It taxes poor people much more than richer people who can protect their assets, their income, etc. And it's not a good way to fund a whole financial system. So there is this issue, and certainly you can see if you look through all the different countries which use inflation targeting, that there's a strong and obvious inflation tax incentive for some of these economies. The zero lower bound is something which people have talked a lot about in the literature recently. It's a nice thing to make a little DSGE model and show how the zero lower bound, that's when you can't reduce interest rates, really tends to hurt an economy when it's faced with a big negative shock like the 2008 financial crisis. So there are lots and lots of DSGE modeled studies looking at the zero lower bound effect. But when you look at this in terms of South Africa, some of the econometrics I actually do in the paper looks at the volatility of interest rates and inflation rates in South Africa. And it's very clear that South Africa has never been even close to hitting the zero lower bound. So I think in terms of what's the right inflation rate for South Africa, the zero lower bound literature, even though it's very large, is simply irrelevant to the case here. You'd have to reduce your inflation rate down an awful lot to have to start worrying about that. There's a very technical thing about how you measure inflation, which means that most statisticians who look at inflation measures would agree that our inflation rates are biased upwards in a fairly serious way. To give you an intuition of why that is, think of how computers have improved over the years. If you were to price computers by a gigawatt of RAM, say, you would see that they were actually getting cheaper and cheaper over time. But because we can price them in terms of a unit, one computer, they actually appear to be getting more expensive over time. And so that sort of quality adjustment simply can't be made in any sort of accurate way. And most statistical offices don't bother. But it could be that 2 or 3% inflation is actually really quite compatible with a zero inflation target because of this bias. There's what I think of as quite an important effect here. Oh, zero bound. Yeah, I think I've said that already. Okay, so oops, I seem to have got out of sync with that. Okay, so I think probably that the strongest argument I can think for having a 2% inflation rate in South Africa is that it's what most other countries do. Now, that sounds like a trivial argument. But when you think about it, if you have a different inflation rate as a target to your biggest trading partners around the world, Europe and the US, etc., then what that means is you have to have a continual devaluation in the exchange rate. And if you actually look at the exchange rate data over the last 20 years or so, there has been, on average, about a 4% devaluation every year, which is what you'd expect with purchasing power parity. But if you also look at the data on a shorter horizon, there have been large swings in the real exchange rate. And that's not good for development and growth in trade, etc. Because when you've got those large swings, it's very hard for agents in the economy who are producing stuff, selling them overseas, or buying from overseas, to be able to predict exactly what you're talking about as the real exchange rate. And so you could be planning 2 or 3 years ahead, and that real exchange rate, when it comes about, could be quite different from what you was expecting. And that's clearly far from ideal. Okay, so what experience is there of changing targets? Let me just... There has been remarkably little experience of changing targets. In the paper, I list about 5 or 6 examples of where countries have actually changed their target. In all cases, it's been a movement towards 2%, and in all cases, there have been very little adverse consequences of that move. So it really does look like inflation targeting works well. That if you have proper expectations going on and the bank has credibility, then you can change that target without huge costs, simply looking at the countries who have done this, and there have been a few. So, in conclusion, got plenty of time still. The benefits of growth of low inflation is very clear. You can see that around the world. Lower inflation benefits the economy over the medium term. There might be very short-term consequences. It depends on how you get that lower inflation. There are clear downward rigidities in price setting, and it's an accepted, realized fact that, a stylized fact rather, that prices are, at least some prices, are sticky downwards. That's not true of all prices. Agricultural prices, for example, tend to be quite flexible upwards and downwards, but there are clearly wage effects which are important there. The zero lower bound, I think, is just irrelevant to South Africa. Government debt servicing, that's maybe an argument that the central bank needs to have with the Treasury, because clearly there are fiscal implications of lower inflation. But I think quite a strong case can be made against running a fiscal policy on the inflation tax. When you come to think about what's the actual cost of the transition from a say, 5% inflation target to a 2% inflation target, I think the whole secret of doing that is to take a long time. By that I mean 3 or 4 years. You announce that in 3 or 4 years you will have been, or you are targeting in 4 years' time, say a 2% inflation rate. If the bank has credibility, and my judgment is that the South African Reserve Bank does have quite a lot of credibility, it's been hitting its target quite successfully for quite a long time, then you can move to that without any real effect. There's been a lot of talk here about Phillips curves. Now, the most important variable in the Phillips curve is expectations. Now, I think it's obvious that when we look at our models, most of those models have no way for the bank's target to get into inflation expectations. These models are often DSGE-type models, which have modeled consistent expectations or rational expectations, if you think that's what they are. And the only way you can actually change the actual level of inflation is to do something like raising unemployment in those models, the Phillips curve effect, because you can't get into the expectations process itself. And that's the key thing in these models, that what the bank needs to do is to affect expectations, and it can do that directly, but when you use the standard DSGE-type models, big macro models, whatever type of model you can think of, there is no mechanism that we've built into those models to allow the expectations to be directly affected by what the central bank is doing. And so the only way you can do it is through the unemployment Phillips curve type effect in those models. But what I'm strongly suggesting is we should build models which have these expectations effects directly in them. You could imagine an inflation expectation variable that was a weighted average of what the bank says is going to happen and what the markets might forecast. And over time, that would converge on the bank's forecast, as long as there's some non-zero weight on the bank's target variable. And you could imagine that type of mechanism in a proper macro model, a DSGE-type model, whatever, and that would give you a real way that the central bank is going to affect things directly through its expectation announcements and its targets. And that means there's no longer a sacrifice ratio in these models. And I think that's really important to understand. In the full paper, I actually estimate a few Phillips curves, partly because Felipe insisted on it. But I also conclude that they're not really relevant, and the unemployment effect in them is so small and weak anyway, that it's very hard to see how we can deal with that. Okay, thank you. You've got 2 minutes left. Okay, over to you.
Thank you. It's coming. There we go. Okay, so 25 years ago, I was a young lecturer, and I came with my students to the budget competition and the budget speech. Old Mutual and Nedbank organized these things back then. And, you know, you go to Parliament, you listen to the minister, and in the evening there's a big banquet at which the minister and the governor is present. So 25 years ago, of course, that was the day the inflation targeting was announced. And that evening, we were standing there, and the governor, Biennial at the time, came in, and he said he agrees fully, but there's two things he wants to talk about. The first one is that the escape clause should be called an explanation clause. And the second thing is we should not talk about 3 to 6%. It should be 6 to 3%, indicating the direction in which we are going. And that is also my question. Are we now, 25 years later, at a 6 to 3% point? Now, in the beginning, you know, there was actually a time in 2001 when the target, there was an announcement that for 2004 and 2005, the target would be 3 to 5%. Okay, but a year later, you know, due to all the volatility and things that happened, it was put up again to 3 to 6%. So we tried to do it and narrow that range, but since then it's been 3 to 6%. That is the picture that we all know all the way from the 1980s. So you can see how inflation, how it went, and then you can see the little black box there was that attempt to narrow it for a short time. But how successful have we been? So there are different ways we can, of course, look at this. The first one is, did we see lower average inflation? And yes, overall, 5.3% for the whole period. And if we break it up into the period with the big crises, you know, the dot-com stuff and the global financial crisis and all of that, versus the period after, it's a bit lower, 5.1 in this period. So, but it's not the 4.5 we at least in the middle of the range. The other way that we also can look at is the variation inflation, and the standard deviation certainly fell. So there you can see if we compare the period 2000 to 2009, the standard deviation was of 3.7%. It subsequently fell to 1.2%. So in that sense, the variation is much lower. And there you can see just a graph of what happened, and you can clearly see after the stuff of the early 2000s, it settled down to a much lower standard deviation. So that, in a sense, is an indication of the success of what we see. Now, other factors also important, like lower inertia and inflation, lower pass-through effects from trade, you know, exchange rate effects and foreign inflation and sensitivity to business cycles and all of that. In general, yes, the picture looks better, but there are still some things present. And for this, I did do some estimation. I'm not going to go into all the details here. That will be available later, but let me just go there. So, in a sense, what I looked at is things like the effect of changes in the nominal effective exchange rate. But then I also thought, let's build in some supply side aspects. I had a look at the change in the electric current generated, because, you know, has the electricity crisis in South Africa, did that put in a supply constraint, and as such push up our inflation a bit. Then the budget balance, yes, I was asked to also have a look a bit at that to see whether it features. And yes, so I did a Markov switching model with two regimes. Okay, that one I'm not going to show for long, so let's just move on to what it means. So in regime, regime 0 would be let's say the high volatility or high volatile inflation, and regime 1 would be the lower volatile or volatility period. So as we know in the early 2000s, yes, there were these two extended periods that were also associated with the global crises, and then there were shorter periods afterwards. And you can see the regime 0, the more volatile one, the average was a bit higher than in regime 1, but also the standard deviation was higher. What is remarkable then is to see how, in a sense, the credibility improved, because these periods of higher volatility got much shorter, and I think that is important. Okay, so. But what did we also see? So the nominal effective exchange rate, particularly in these volatile periods, that is very a big variable there. But then yeah, there you can see what that does. So that's just your nominal effective exchange rate. So you've seen the 5 periods that I highlighted earlier. Those basically coincide with these high volatility periods in the nominal effective exchange rate. Then I've also looked at US inflation, because it's interesting that when you do a regression of the 1 year ahead, the BER estimate of 1 year ahead expected inflation, you regress that on a number of variables. The one thing that came out is the US inflation, a quarterly lagged. So it seems that plays a role. Well, interesting enough, if you look at the correlation coefficient between South African inflation and the lag of the US inflation, there's a correlation coefficient is 0.36. So there's something going on there too. So, and that seems to be playing a role, particularly in the more stable periods. Then the electricity, if we look at the change in the electricity current generated, that seems to have an inflationary effect, rather, an inflationary effect. So that has seemed to have been playing a role. The budget balance, yes, also seems to be playing a role. I suppose when you run budget deficit of 5% and your savings is only 12% in the economy, you can expect it to have something of an effect. That's just the electric current generated, courtesy of the Reserve Bank's bulletin. So showing you what that does. But you can see there's about a 10% drop in that supply over time. So that has had its effect. Okay, the budget balance we all know. That's just the income account. So, okay, then the other big issue, administered prices. That's the other thing that government does. There's Chris and Constantine's paper that they did 2-3 years ago. But this is not a new issue. You can see all the way back to 2001 and 2005, we were even talking about it. So administered prices remain an issue. There you can see why. That's just electricity, okay? And then the red lines, that's the inflation target or the range. So administered prices is certainly a role. If you look at all administered prices, that's your green line there. You can see it's consistently above the target range, and it's also much more volatile. So I then had a look at just ran almost something like a Granger causality, but doing that with a general to specific model, and see what comes out. What is interesting, okay, again, I'm not going to stand with that. Let me give you that. The bottom left-hand one is the important one, the impulse response. Administered prices do impact your inflation numbers. So we know that, and I think that is certainly something that needs to be looked at. So, should it be a 6 to 3% story? Should we go from 6 to 3%? Well, first of all, it will align us closer, and I think that has been said many times this morning and earlier today. It will align us, of course, closer to our trading partners. So South Africa and the US, as I've shown, there's already those inflation rates are already to some extent correlated. It makes it's just we are like 2 percentage points higher, so that's the point. If you have a look there, 2001 to 2024, we are that checkered line there. That's where we are compared to the other countries. If you break it up a bit, 2010 to 24, you see we're still much higher. Okay, there's the COVID period when everybody was higher, but then after COVID in 2024, you can see the other countries already going back. Of course, we'll see, with tariffs and all of that stuff, whether it will come down all the way in some countries. But again, we seem to be stuck a bit at a higher level, but it would make sense for us to get in line. for a few reasons. It reduces exchange rate risk, it lowers the risk, and lower risk improves investment and trade climate. It reduces the variability of inflation during more volatile exchange rate fluctuations. And there you can just have a look. That is the 12-month moving standard deviation of your change in the nominal versus the real effective exchange rate. And the difference, in other words, the inflationary component. And if you can reduce that, and then the blue line will be closer to the red line, particularly at these peaks when you run into some crises. So that I think is important. But now there's the issue of, should we do this? Is there a higher sacrifice ratio? Do we need to give up some GDP growth if inflation is not completely anchored so strongly? Now, earlier research indicate, particularly in the 2017 episode, when the announcement was made to bring it, to the 4.5%, that at that stage the sacrifice ratio was not so big. But I think if we look if we move forward to where we are now, and we look at the sacrifice ratio, particularly at these episodes when inflation came down, and I looked at cases where the inflation came down with, let's say, 1.5 percentage points year on year, compare that to some measure of GDP, average GDP growth relative to a longer run average of GDP growth. What is the sort of sacrifice ratio one would be looking at? Well, again, the episodes, it's not uniform from episode to episode. In the early 2000s, we brought down inflation quite significantly, but that was also a time when we grew at 3.5%. So it was, completely the opposite of what you would expect. But then in 2009, it sort of jumped around, and then there was a sacrifice ratio. Then the two shorter episodes there in 2015, 2017, 18, around about there, that there was not much going on there in terms of sacrifice ratio. But now it seems to be up again. So there seems to be something, a higher sacrifice ratio. So that is an element that one needs to keep in mind. And the question then is, how do you think about that in terms of how quickly do you want to move, let's say, from a 4.5 to a 3% range? I think here we need to talk about the role of fiscal policy. It is not just a role for monetary policy. What I've shown earlier in terms of the impact of the budget deficit, what I've shown in terms of the administered prices, I think all of that plays a role. And if we can get our electricity supply, we seem to be making some progress in alleviating that, but will it still be not such a damper if we really start to grow? So that would be a question. But overall, I think bringing the target from 4.5 to 3%, that is not just something for monetary policy. It needs to be a combination, and fiscal policy will have to come to the party. So let me just also look at so. If we start thinking about this, if we look at the standard deviation of the period 2010 to 2024, it's 1.24% roughly. And if we look at the average inflation during that period, we see that one standard deviation takes us just outside the target band of 6%, and that's just one standard deviation. Okay, if we reduce it to 4.5%, then we would stay within it. But that is just one standard deviation. That is 68% all the time. So it's not 2 or 3 standard deviations. But if we look at bringing it down to 3%, then the target range can be with this. Bringing it down to 3%, but with a 1.2 standard deviation, percent standard deviation. That means that a target range of 1.5 to 4.5%. That would cover that one standard deviation. But of course, you would have a case of what if you then have your events with 2 standard deviations, the shocks. I think Revit's discussion earlier in terms of have a proper explanation clause. So these things will happen. Your exchange rate shocks will occur, and you need to just explain it. Don't increase the band during these events. Just keep it what it is, but explain how you're going to get back. Yeah, that is. And then again, to finish off, there's a role for fiscal policy to play too in bringing all of this down. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Being the last has got, on one hand, a lot of things already been said. I don't have to say that as much. I have this responsibility to know how to keep you awake. I have 30-year experience with classes, therefore should be. One of the things I said, okay, I don't put any equation, I only put pictures. I tell a story. Because I was asked to, sort of have a review of what the experience of the inflation targeting is. But there is a lot of very good reviews, and we have to understand also that the South African monetary policy has been one of the most studied. The number of papers, the number of analysis of the South African monetary policy is very wide in international standard. For the number of papers on South Africa, very wide. Therefore, what I end up doing, it was reflecting on what I have learned in the process of being in this place. I studied this place, and what I learned working with all, with Tumi Sang and Charles and Luchel that are here in the room, but with Caterina, Giovanni, and Vincent that are somewhere else in the world. Because in this process was always question will arrive, and then we will sit down and try to find a way to understand what the story. Therefore, what I end up doing is just showing a bit of a picture show of a bit this story of monetary policy, and not only monetary policy in South Africa, really starting from what the governor started this morning, really to think about what monetary policy was before and how things changing with the inflation target. This one was true for everybody. When you go back and look at how monetary policy was done before, it's not that they're not worrying about inflation, but that the system was totally discretionary and arbitrary in some sense. Now, therefore, there was movement, very large movement of the instrument, very large real interest rate continuously, and there was no really systematicity in the relationship between what the policy was doing and what is your final objective. And therefore, you were moving from try to control the exchange rate, to try to control the monetary aggregate, etc., to try to respond to each individual shock. The issue is that when you enter in an open capital market, this kind of monetary policy is not possible anymore. Because what you have to give, and this is what inflation targeting give you, is essentially an information channel towards the market, towards the economy, that allow you to build up stock of credibility. Therefore, what you are actually doing, you are committing to a long-term anchor, especially for countries with weak institutions. This was extremely important to show that not only you are committed, but you also show how you are going to achieve that and what are the instruments, the things that you do to achieve that. Therefore, this element of information channel of the inflation target is fundamental to understand why this works. Because essentially what was giving to countries like South Africa was a system that constrained your discretion and allow you to build up credibility, and more credibility you build up, the more flexibility you achieve in using your instrument. Because your long-term target is clear to everybody. Therefore, it's a sort of this, we need more flexibility, especially in a place where there is a lot of shock, external shock, etc., a lot of uncertainty. But this flexibility is useful only if you can anchor the long term, because otherwise the flexibility become internalized in asset pricing, in country risk, etc., and therefore this flexibility is not really useful if you don't anchor it. And this one, what inflation targeting was doing. It's also true that when you move to the inflation targeting, it was not optimal at all to move to inflation targeting. You read the thing, at that time there is all this condition about why you have to do inflation, how you have to do inflation targeting. Inflation targeting, you do it because it's necessary, because whatever you tried before was not. And then there is experimentation, and you try, and you move. The second phase is really sort of the grid moderation, sort of the South Africa grid moderation. This was Stan Duplessis in one of the review talk about the South Africa grid moderation. There was the paradise of 2000-2007 when everything seems perfect, and in which there is the first sign that everything seems to move in the right direction. Really, the grid moderation is two stories. One is a story of shocks. Therefore, the grid moderation was a time that we have so many positive shocks that allow the system somehow to move along. And on this one sort of is a distinction between supply and demand shock. Therefore, you will see that in the period that is the sort of grid moderation, what we have is a lot of very good supply shock, that is in terms of trade shock, and part of the internal shock of opening of the economy and so on. The issue here is also the fact that in reality, these are all supply shocks, and this one is one of the characteristics of this country. The majority of the shock are supply shock. And one of the issues, in some sense, we had to learn how we respond to supply shocks. Because on one hand, monetary policy is about responding to supply shock. Demand shock are easy. If the issue was controlling demand shock, you don't need monetary policy. Price and quantity go in the same direction, and therefore it's very easy to use the instrument. The problem of monetary policy is that when you have supply shock, you always operate on a trade-off. And you have to accept for how long you want the increase of inflation in order to absorb a part of the negative movement of an output. And your choice of how long determines how strongly you respond. One of the things about emerging countries is that because you don't have a stock of credibility, although I would never use emerging countries anymore, because it was, I could talk about Italy, about emerging countries, it would be very easy. One of the things about country like this is that because you don't have a stock of credibility, you cannot allow supply shock to remain in the inflation series for a very long time, because you risk to use whatever credibility you accumulated before. And this one, you have seen it in the reaction to the last inflation shock. No emerging country had talked about transitory versus permanent. You could not afford to talk about transitory, to doubt the fact that if you don't react, you might lose control. This one is a characteristic of when a country has so many supply shocks, but also a stock of credibility to build up. The story was also, therefore, it's not was a great moderation, but it was not nice. Martin Luther King has got this non-inflationary state of bliss. In reality, behind these good shocks, behind this period, already from 2005, underlying there was an increasing weakness of the economy. Therefore, there is a real story behind whatever monetary policy was, or whatever macroeconomic policy was. That really, already in 2005, the reform, or whatever transition of the economy was stalling, and what you have is an underlying reduction of productivity that will accompany us up to now. The other story, and this one is come again from a paper by Stan of that time that was analyzing the fiscal, the budget balance and the structural budget balance. That is one of the things that is all through the story is that we all overestimate the potential output of the economy. Therefore, at the time, we are overestimating because we were not really understanding the weakness that was starting to believe, started to build up in the economy. And we were achieving fiscal surpluses, and we had fiscal balance, but in reality, we were overestimating the capacity of the economy, and this one come to bite when we arriving at the financial crisis. And the financial crisis is really have two characteristics. One is that the war dominate, the war shock dominate our response. But the other thing is that this kind of crisis really show the weaknesses of the system overall. The weakness, if you want, also the framework, the monetary framework or the fiscal framework, etc. And I always have this, therefore, monetary policy at the time is all about managing this external risk. The shock actually in South Africa is not, in terms of GDP, very big. Therefore, in terms of GDP, the effect was shallow. Here, I always compare South Africa, obviously Chile, Germany, United Kingdom. The change in GDP relative to the other country was not particularly significant. What was very significant was the collapse of the labor market that we are still having through process of hysteresis is still with us. The shock never really disappeared in the series. That kind of situation in which every shock, every supply shock, has the potential to remain permanent, it means also that monetary policy has very little room, or if you want, also fiscal policy will have very little room, just as a demand management tool, to really push the economy back. Therefore, this one was really, compared to, the black one is Chile, the other two are countries that we eat much more, Germany and United Kingdom. We lost 1 million jobs in the space of 1 month. And then a shock after shock after shock, we just accumulated the amount of. Now, this one, therefore, is really show a sort of weaknesses, but at that time, we are really talk about reacting against external shocks and how monetary policy try to manage this external risk. When we arrive in 2012, 2011 or 2012, I want to show this picture because this picture is the black line, the dark line is the country risk premium, and the gray one is the VIX. Therefore, one is a measure of international risk, and the other is a measure of national risk. According to the dilemma, what we have is that a lot of the national risk is driven in the moment of shock, or big international shock, is driven by the VIX. Therefore, it's just risk on, risk off. But what did happen from 2011, that these things separate. That the amount of internal risk and the accumulation of internal risk really dominate the policy space. I say the Marikana massacre, if you want, the starting point that it's clear that the weakness of the economy, the structural weakness of the economy, the impossibility really to move away from the stagnation really started. And then you have all the political uncertainty around the institutional stability. That is exemplified here by the firing of Minister Nene. You see straight away the spike of CDS after that. And essentially in the moment, now the bank assume, and in all the process, the bank assume almost the role of credibility provider last resort. Therefore, what is different is that in a place where you don't have a very strong credibility stock, there is one institution that through the policy, through the communication, the transparency, have to fight against this increase in cost. Now, the thing about this is this one has very strong real effect. So what's happening in this period is that this one sort of dampen, therefore we are in a period of total stagnation. that in the analysis we did, and this one affect the long-term interest rate, the analysis we did with Tumisang, really we wanted to ask how much is because of monetary policy, how much because of fiscal policy. Essentially, is all the story is really a structural story, an economy that and a political system that really dampen. This one is simply a colorful picture about what the blue one is what we should have expected given the monetary fiscal policy we had, and the red one is what we had. And in all conditions, GDP is much lower than expected, output is, prices are much higher than expected because risk premium are much higher than expected. Therefore, the riskiness in the economy really dampened the, and in the second period, what we have is also a build-up of what we call a sort of a speed limit in the functioning of fiscal policy, and the cost of increasing long-term yield become bigger than whatever expansionary effect the fiscal policy will have. I want to just talk a bit in finishing about this issue of the target. The way I like to think about this is this. We are in a uncertain environment, and therefore I like to think in terms of uncertainty. The 6% and the 3% of the band are not indifferent. They have a quality that is very different. Therefore, if you believe that 6% is very costly or potentially costly, and is very different qualitatively than 3%, automatically your best response is to have an inflation target that is actually below the middle target. Because you want to minimize the risk to hit the 6%. Therefore, in some sense, the fact that we have such a wide band, by definition tells you that there is something not optimal. Because we are not indifferent in the fluctuation between the two. Inflation is not neutral relative to the decision. That is also why the nature of the band, what Refet was saying before, the nature of the band also determines the nature of the expectation. Because if you have inflation at 6% or at 3%, makes a very big difference, and therefore automatically you'll be more backward in the process. Here, as everybody does, we check South Africa relative to Chile. The story is always the same. The story is, it's not that Chile was optimal in any way. But the long-term steady state of the inflation is very much determined by the regime you use. It's not indifferent. It's not, there is not a inflation process separated from the regime you use. There is also, for example, the issue why I don't like the concept of sacrifice ratio. Because the concept of sacrifice ratio is not about an exogenous change of the policy and the effect of an exogenous change of the policy. Look just at the correlation in the data, positive or negative. In fact, you always find the sacrifice ratio that sometimes are positive, sometimes are negative, because the correlation depends on the shock that you have. And therefore, what we try to do with the Caterina is to understand instead when you have an exogenous policy change, like pushing at the 4.5, that was the very few examples that we could have, what was the effect of that? There is no real effect. There is positive effect on asset pricing because there is a reduction of the long-term risk premium because you clarify the instrument. Therefore, when we think about the cost of any movement, we need to understand what is the cost in terms of risk. And therefore, can we manage this external risk by clarifying the target in a range that does not affect that is really neutral relative to the decision of the individual. Being between 6 and 3 is a much wider, a much more significant difference in choices. And I wanted to finish, appunto, everybody's an emerging market, risk increase everywhere else, but that one has been said before. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel. Very interesting presentations. So I know it's late afternoon, but actually you managed to keep us very lively, so thank you to that. So I think I'm going to abuse the position that I have a little bit. I'm going to fire the first set of questions or requests to the panel, and then I can open to the floor. So I would like to ask Professor Hall, so in your presentation, you did touch on the costs and benefits of inflation, of a lower target. So I would like to request if you could sort of maybe say a bit more, be a bit more specific about those costs and benefits. In particular, how to think about fiscal benefits or fiscal costs of moving to a lower target. I think that would be very helpful. And before I give you the mic, I'm going to ask Professor Viegi to touch a little bit more on the transition, sort of the transition to a lower target. Suppose South Africa wants to go there. How do we actually sort of approach it? How do we do it? And also one of the things that I think came up in the morning, which I'm also sort of interested in, is this idea of opportunistic disinflation. And I think in 2017 to 2020 or 2019, that's pretty much what the SAP did, a bit of opportunistic disinflation, and it really worked. And of course, at the moment, I mean, inflation is very sort of modest at the moment. And the question is, do you see that as, so what would that mean if for example, this South Africa wanted to move to a lower target under the current circumstances? And then for Professor Berger, so I think you did touch on the issue of rigidities in the economy. I think it would be useful to sort of say something about, because one of the things that we always worry about is, well, we have an issue with admin prices, we have an issue with competition in the economy, we have an issue with labor markets. So how do you think these sort of rigidities, do you see these as major obstacles to a transition to a lower inflation target? And if so, what could be done about it? So those are sort of my sort of opening questions to the panel. So I can start with Professor Wall.
Okay, thank you. You said the fiscal costs and benefits, and now there's an obvious short-term cost to the fiscal side of the economy, which is the loss of the inflation tax. And that's very obvious, and the fact that you can't easily tax parts of the economy, especially in the case of a country like South Africa, which has a relatively large informal sector. But in terms of the long-run outcome, all the evidence we have suggests that by moving to a lower level of inflation, the level of output will be higher. And of course, fiscal income taxes comes from the growth in the economy. So if you have a higher level of growth in the long run, the fiscal authorities will actually also be better off, although there will be the short-run loss of the inflation tax. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the inflation tax is a very bad tax. The fiscal authorities should be making judgments about income redistribution, etc., rather than just leaving it to the arbitrary way that an inflation tax hits poor people much harder than rich people. I think the big issue is how do you move to the lower inflation rate? And what I tried to be clear about is that there's not just one way. It's not just a Phillips curve mechanism which says you have to have a certain sacrifice, at least in the short run, because of course we all know that in the long run the Phillips curve is vertical. The question is there another way of doing that? And that's what I was trying to emphasize, that by working directly on the expectations effects, I think there is no need to have any particular adverse effects as you move, as long as you move slowly and with very clear announcements. And if you don't always hit your reducing path of inflation, explain why you don't hit those targets. In the actual written paper, I talk quite a lot about some things that Mervyn King has written. And he claims, or he states very clearly, that in his view, it's not inflation targeting itself which made the big difference. It's the transparency of policy that made the really big difference. And I remember when I was at the Bank of England, that was in the mid-1980s or late 1980s, policy was completely opaque. We would sit in a monetary policy committee, which is a big committee, and we'd decide what interest rates should be or if they should change. And then we make a recommendation to the Treasury, who were actually in charge at that time, because the bank wasn't independent. But then nobody would tell the public what we'd done and why we'd done it. And so the whole surrounding was a very British sort of thing, where the bank would give nods to the city about what they thought should happen. And, it often did happen, but sometimes it didn't, and nobody in the public knew what was going on. So the big change to inflation targeting was not that we suddenly got a new target, it's that we suddenly started telling people what we were doing, and now you've got the inflation report that the bank produces all the time with its little fan charts of uncertainty and a big story each time about what went wrong and what went right and why it's gone wrong. And I think that's how a bank keeps the credibility that it's got, especially when there are shocks coming along. You have to explain why you're doing these things. And people, at least the people who count the market, etc., are smart enough to understand when you explain to them what's happening.
Thank you. Professor Baker?
Thanks. So in terms of the rigidities, yes, when we look at the sacrifice ratio, and Nicola is quite right, this is not a fixed number. It depends really on what drives it from various corners of the economy. And so the sort of positive number that we see now after COVID in itself, that should not be a given. So when we talk about reducing the target to, let's say, 3%, I agree in that sense with Stephen that it should be an expectations, that should be the focus of what we do. Start with the expectations, influence the expectations, and then work from there. And if you do this not all in 1 year, but you do it, let's say, 0.5 percentage points per year over a 3-year period, to go from 4.5 to 3 years, and you can get some buy-in from the fiscal side to announce measures that it's supportive of that. Then you can construct a narrative that makes it easier to get there. We were talking in the morning about stories. So when you talked about that, I think it is a question of constructing the right story, sticking to it, and then build that credibility. If we're succeeding at it after 1 year, year 2 will be easier. Year 3 might then be easier. So I think in that sense, there are no given rigidities. It is a matter of managing it and work it down from that. But again, it's not just a monetary policy thing. It's something that we need to look at from various angles, and we do need to get to an answer with respect to things like administered prices. Everybody needs to come to the party on that, and then try to do it that way.
Yeah, I'm not gonna have the Lagavulin after, I think. This is between me and Roy. The issue is, I want to be blunt. You had in South Africa a target of 6% for 10 years. Because the effective target after the financial crisis was 6%. Because this one is where the market converged. There was the acceptable level for the bank. Therefore, in Sarset, you already moved the target. And you are already moving the target by changing the way you interpret these numbers. Now what you are saying is that the 6% is much more costly than the 3%. Therefore, you're already not targeting the middle, because the precautionary thing to do is to be below the 4.5%, because the cost upward, like we were saying with Refetto, the cost upward is much higher than the cost downward. this one produce, in the same way that the expectation were converging to the 6, the expectation will converge and we will focus on the lower end of the band. This one happened by changing the policy in the interpretation of the mandate and the policy, and the change in the interpretation of the evaluation of what is the mean 6 and what is the meaning 3. Now, we can have a discussion, because I think it's always, we always have discussion by proxy. Because the discussion is, do we need high inflation? Because we have the fiscal problem, because we have, because wages are, because the other thing is that we want inflation because hoping that then we cut real wages and we cut the real value of the grant, so that we do a fiscal adjustment by reducing the real value of what our expenditure is. Allora, let's say, we want to cut wages and we want to cut the value of the grant. If this is the policy, if this is what we want to achieve with higher inflation. Or we consider that higher inflation actually is expensive. The higher inflation is expensive, and that towards the converging to a low level of inflation will give the possibility of reform, of productivity gain, etc. Therefore, the choice is not about the target, it is what is the role of inflation in an economy like this. Then, I am, the advantage of a professor that whatever you do, then I do a paper, that's fine. You do an experiment, it's fine. Therefore, but this is the policy choice. Really is really the policy choice. It's not, is 3 optimal or not? I don't know if 3, but I know that 3 is very different from 6. The effect of 3 is very different from 6. The bank has signaled that there is a difference. Therefore, the bank is signaling that the expectation should be below the 4.5. You already changed the target.
Thank you very much to the panel. Yes, questions, colleagues? Okay, so since the previous chairs were starting from this side, going this way, I'm going to start from this side. Monique? And, okay, Keke.
Thank you very much. I'm directing the question at Philippe and Nicola, whoever wants to answer it. A lot of people are talking about suggesting that moving down should happen more slowly. But it's not always clear to me whether they're talking about a staggered target, so that you mention, choose a different number and, decrease it over time, or if you just mean a long horizon to get there. And I think this is really, it's a really important distinction, because if you tell us that, we should move down in 0.5% increments or something, you create the opportunity to fail many times in your fine-tuning. And I worry about this. Whereas if you just say that there's flexibility, you've got a longer horizon, all you're saying is you're allowing some flexibility for shocks to happen on your way down. These are two very different things.
Kiachile?
I'm Kiachile Lasame from the National Treasury. I have a question for Prof. Viegi. There's obviously a lot of concerns, even in this room, about the cost of disinflation, from what I've heard. So I wanted to ask if, it makes a difference, for example, instead of moving from a 4.5% inflation target to 3%, you have a shift to, a 2 to 4% target range. But obviously, you use communication to anchor inflation expectations at the midpoint. Because, a shift from 4.5 to 3, or from 4.5 to a target range of 2 to 4, then the cost of disinflation become less of a concern. And obviously, assuming that, you've had this build-up in credibility, which you mentioned, the central bank can use communication instead to anchor expectations at the midpoint.
I think, can we take those?
You go first. You want to
So
go?
whoever wants to go first.
We can. To Monique's question, that's very relevant. I mean, in a sense, we tried that already in the early 2000s. You know, going from 3 to 6 to 3 to 5, and then that didn't work quite so well, and then we went back to 3 to 6. Now, one of the earlier speakers this morning mentioned that inflation targeting, you know, it's not, you know, it's not 6.3 or 5.1. You need to be careful. So I do think that working with the whole range, you know, talking about the midpoint, but taking the whole range, that still leaves you with some room to maneuver. The reason I'm also thinking that is that, and here I'm going to use a fiscal analogy. So in the last 10 years, you know, the debt GDP ratio was always projected to stabilize in year 3 of the medium term. So in a sense, for this to be credible, we need some markers of success on the way there. And I think that is important. And yes, you might miss it, but that is how credibility works. You need to achieve it to demonstrate your credibility. So I am also wary of point targets because, you know, we are not in the business of 0.3 and 0.2. It's the risk doesn't work that way. But I do think that moving the whole range with its midpoint slowly down over 3 or 4 years, whatever we might need to talk about, that can help because that helps you to register these early gains. And then, of course, you've got to stick to it.
I think there is an advantage, whatever I said before, but I think there is an advantage of thinking about the monetary policy framework in a wider reform framework that stabilize and increase the productivity possibility of this country. A lot of the story I was telling about, underlying, there is a productivity story. Monetary policy actually is just at the top of this. You can be as good as you want about monetary policy, but when you have growth equal to 0, it means that any shock will be inflationary. Anything. Therefore, the story of Chile, they were going from much higher inflation to the 2%. Behind, there is a productivity story. The story we're telling with Vincent is a collapse of productivity, especially in the sector that more should drive the economy. There was mining, manufacturing, etc. Therefore, I think there is an advantage if you talk about monetary policy in a wider context of policy reform that push the economy out of this of the stagnation. Therefore, and I think it's more that. The credibility of a system like inflation targeting has never been an issue of missing it sometime. Has always been how much you were convincing in showing that you will do whatever it takes, to use the Mario Draghi story, to whatever it takes to achieve that target. If you have a system that allows you to build that, the short one really are not, you see Chile miss, but then the steady state goes to 3%. South Africa miss, and the steady state go to 5.1, 5.2. Therefore, what is the steady state? What is the objective? And what is the overall institutional commitment, not only toward monetary policy, but really towards increased productivity, increase beyond even sort of because also, just to finish, because also we talk about a fiscal story, but what we show with the Tumisang is it's not a fiscal story, it's something below that also affects also the fiscal. Because if you don't have productivity, if you don't grow, obviously the fiscal position will be more and more difficult. Then you enter in in a sort of, is a negative loop. The negative shocks, the negative economy affect the fiscal, that affect the economy, and so on. Therefore, the question is, can monetary policy, can the overall institution, give a shock to the system that we enter in some positive, by reducing a sort of the fundamental risk of the economy, if you want, or the fundamental cost in the economy.
Thanks. So, Prof, we're going to take more questions, then you can come in. Yes, Andrea, and then Roy, and then Mama Kete.
Yep.
Andres. So we'll take 4 in the middle for this round.
Okay, my question concerns the role of fluctuations in raw material prices. So none of the speakers has mentioned raw material prices or the international raw material prices and the consequences for South African inflation. So is this because you think this is irrelevant, or would that just be an additional aspect in your answering of the optimal rate of inflation?
Thank you very much, Roy from the BER. In the discussion on the fiscal consequences of a low inflation target, and I always say that the central banks are the only people that live in the real world. The Treasury operates in the nominal world. Wouldn't the consequence of a lower inflation rate and a lower inflation target, in terms of the Fisher equation, being lower debt service costs, a lower rate of long-term borrowing costs? Sure. And we know that obviously debt service costs are now the second largest spending item. So isn't there another additional positive benefit of a low inflation rate, which would be to reduce long-term borrowing costs?
Okay. This is Nketeni Nesengani from the Economic Research Department at SAP. I want to phrase my question this way. We are sitting in a room with different economic agents. We have households, we have government. Okay, in the midst of the companies, we also have the bankers. So if we were to say we are lowering the target to 2%, of those agents, who is the one who is going to lose out or to be most affected? I'm asking this because if you look at the cost that we say the economic agents will face, we see that the poor are the ones who seems to suffer a lot. I think there is an agreement on that. And what is the benefit of this tax that the government is getting, or this inflation tax, relative to the cost to the poor? We know that if you are a business, you need inputs to produce what you produce. I'm not sure I will touch on the commercial banks here in terms of what is the cost to the commercial banks of higher inflation. Will the commercial banks, do they stand to lose if inflation is lower? We know that here we're talking about in terms of the real interest rates that may be accrued depending on where they are operating from. I think that should shed some light in terms of where things should be. The other point that I wanted to does it matter if our inflation target is in line with the inflation of our major trading partner? Maybe just to elaborate a little bit back on that. Thanks.
Let's take Mama Katie, and then we can get to the panel.
Okay, I've got 2 questions. The first one is around whether there isn't an argument to be made for better policy coordination in order to get the inflation lower if there's a decision to take the target lower. So I suppose what I'm asking here is that one of the things that was raised earlier is this idea that fiscal and admin price management would have to be aligned in order to lower the costs of getting inflation lower. The last time we lowered the inflation target, we had a much, not better, because that's not a right word, but like an improving fiscal dynamic. We had administered price inflation that was managed by fiat in a sense, and that helped to get the inflation target lower. So right now, given the current context, is there an argument to be made that, well, you need to get the fiscal anchor first, and then once that is in place and you're getting growth coming through and reform progress coming through nicely, only then would it then make sense to look at the inflation target? Or can you just do the inflation target in the absence of those other policy moves? Then the other question is, I think I've seen a lot of numbers being bandied about, but like just from each one of you, what is the right inflation target for South Africa?
I think for now, let's get to the panel. There's 4 questions already. Let's just try to be brief so that we can take one more round.
Let's maybe start with Stephen, given that that we have been talking a lot.
Okay, 2%. I think the strongest argument for that is simply because that's what most of the rest of the world is doing already, and it will help to stabilize the exchange rate, which I think is a big issue. The point about debt service costs with lower inflation and lower interest rate, yes, of course, that's an important factor as well. I think we just didn't bother to mention that, but yeah, that's certainly a consideration for the fiscal authorities. I think when you're talking about commodity prices, then when commodity prices change, that's a change in relative prices. The issue is whether that change in relative prices feeds through into increased inflation overall or not. And I think that's where the bank's credibility and expectations effect really start to come in. So if unions and wage setters have a clear idea of what inflation is going to be, then a commodity price change is just a relative price change, and relative prices have to change all the time. That's fine. But if the bank has enough credibility, then there won't be that translation into an inflationary process which starts up, and that's the key difference.
Thank you. Philip?
So on raw material prices, I think the recent example of when we talk about food prices in South Africa and the input of fertilizer prices, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was the fertilizer prices went through the roof, given that a lot of fertilizer come from that part of the world. But that was something that you can pick up when you look at food prices. But then again, you need to distinguish between primary and secondary effects and the like. So it's not irrelevant. It's certainly something that one can look at. Talking about who's going to lose out, the question we got from that part of the room. If I listen to the budget, the one thing that all income taxpayers will pick up in the couple of months once this budget passes is that the income tax brackets were not adjusted. So in effect, there's a real increase in taxes right there. And of course, if inflation is lower, then then the bracket creep is smaller. There was a previous Minister of Finance who, at one of a dinner once said, "Without inflation, without bracket creep, we are dead." Now, it's a hidden tax increase. So I think that is the biggest losing party in this, with given more stable inflation. but I do think that we need to also take a bit more of a dynamic look at this. If you reduce inflation, if that helps you to establish a more stable exchange rate, and you can reduce exchange rate risk, and that can create a more conducive environment for investment. Of course, it's a necessary, not a sufficient condition for higher investment. There's a lot of other things that also need to come in play and deals with policy certainty and so on, but it's certainly a component of it. Then that makes a big contribution. So, and higher, if that can contribute to itself to higher growth in the longer term, then you will get more taxes again. You know, so it's one needs to look at this in a bit more of a dynamic setting. In terms of the administered prizes, I think there's something we need to also maybe look at on a more micro level. A lot of government or state-owned enterprises, because they are monopolies, they set their prices in a cost-plus manner. And that means you just pass it through. And if we can look at market structures and get more competition in these markets, let's talk about the market for electricity. If it is not so easy to every year just go to NERSA and say, I want a 30% increase in the electricity, but if there is a more competitive setting of the electricity price, then you can't just do a cost-plus approach. And I think when we deal with administered prizes, and particularly with prizes set by municipalities or state-owned enterprises, we need to look at the price-setting mechanisms there and then talk about how do we get more competition there. If it's not possible to get more competition, we need to take that explicitly into account when we look at the regulation of those prizes so as to get a better handle on the administered price mechanism. The magic number of, I would think a 3% target would be, that would bring us in line. You remember the graph that I put up there comparing us to our trade partners? That would bring us in line with what is happening there. And I don't think it's impossible to get there. It is something that I think we need to work towards and not just wait for all the other things to be in place. But getting the other things in place will help.
I want to say something about the distribution effect because we discuss with Mankoba very, very often about how we model this because it's not obvious. We have a lot of priors of what the distributional effect of these things are, but a lot of our priors are also developing models in which the inequality, the characteristic of the different agent is, maybe inequality that you have sort of in industrialized country or in country where everybody has got some access to asset to smoothing. While instead what we have here is a situation where a lot of people depend directly on transfers. A lot of people do not have access to financial market, but they also supply labor, therefore there can be the labor effect, the asset price effect. And it is not obvious, and I think there is also time that we have to, let's study better and let's understand really better all the problem, the connection. But, there is a cost of 6. That is also what you were saying about the, consider the natural rate that you are using, at the bank. Is natural rate is the inflation target plus, a potential growth, plus you add to that a risk premium. That is a combination of what are the potential volatility of the inflation and the volatility of the exchange rate that is on top of that. The higher is your inflation, for if your inflation is at 6%, you will have to pay a higher risk premium, given also that the majority of your fiscal cost is long. And actually you are paying the price of the good thing that you borrow, the South Africa borrow in the national currency, because all these long-term costs are put on top of the return of that asset as an insurance for those that buy the asset. Therefore, now we are talking about a sort of natural rate that, we are talking about 7.5, 7.5, that is a high natural rate. But it's all built in by the kind of inflation target you have, the kind of risk that you have in the economy, both in terms of nominal risk, fluctuation of the exchange rate, fluctuation of the inflation, and in terms of real risk, in terms of the fluctuation of the real economy. Now, this one is high. And therefore, stop investment, stop the possibility of, and therefore it becomes again a catch-22 situation. Somewhere you have to start from. If we if we wait for everything, that is the experience of all these emerging countries, is, do it. In the sense that somehow you have to start a positive feedback loop in which reduce the risk premium for the country, reduce the natural rate of interest, and therefore allow the bank to reduce actually the interest rate. But because actually, you are reducing the risk, and therefore this one increases the possibility of investment, etc. So the problem is really not to increase the nominal cost, it's to reduce what is the basic cost in this economy. And therefore, it's not going to be the Deus ex machina or the change of everything, but it's a signal that a positive feedback loop can start if there is a sort of an agreement or a certain agreement around that. The number I give you want 3, I give you 3. It's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to disappoint some of you colleagues because we have sort of run out of time, really. I know there's interest and the governor wants to come in, so. Okay, so governor.
I just got struck by one thing about this inflation tax, and I think that it misses something. Government has 6 trillion rands, if I get this thing right. No, not 6 trillion. Government has some 3 trillion rand of inflation-linked debt. That is not insignificant. So government can inflate this debt away. There will be a very big other tax on it called debt service costs, which is already standing at 424 billion rand. And there is refinancing of nominal debt over the next 3 years of just over 6 trillion rand. That is not small change. And globally, the risk-free rate has gone up, and our slice of bread in South Africa is not particularly palatable to eat. You will need to put more than butter. You'll have to put butter, jam, and peanut butter to get people to eat our slice of bread. And that says that refinancing that with a higher inflation rate over the next 3 years will come at massive debt servicing costs. So you can't inflate that away either. And thirdly is that if ever there is one group of workers who have understood the inflation targeting very well, together with their employer, has been public servants. They have always indexed their salary demands to inflation, and they have managed to lock it for the next 3 years. It's inflation plus. So keeping inflation where it is or allowing it to get higher means that government is going to pay more in debt service costs. And so the costs of a higher inflation target are not insignificant for government. And I hear people talking about the sacrifice ratio of, oh no, how much are we giving away in output? But it's also based on this wrong premise that somehow we can just grow our way out of our fiscal problems. Yeah. And can we turn that around and says that we probably might not be growing because the cost of capital in this economy is high, and the reason it is high is because the biggest and highest quality borrower in this economy is borrowing the biggest proportion of the savings of the nation and leaving very little for the others. And that thus raises the cost of capital and thus choking economic activity. But somehow we think that if we pray very hard and growth comes, these problems will go ahead. No offense to the religious ones, but I don't think prayer is a very useful economic strategy. And the question was raised, which was raised about the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. Very important. It's in the Public Finance Management Act that there must be coordination of macroeconomic policy, and it lies with one authority, is the Treasury. And there is a false dichotomy here of we have always known what the monetary policy anchor is. It's in the inflation target. We have not had a fiscal anchor. If we did, it has been fairly soft, but there is a big debate. There is a paper that had gone out about the possibility of an anchor. And again, we are engaged in a debate. We can't lower the target until the other anchor is in place. But we moved from 6% to 4.5% with no anchor, and there wasn't, it's from the evidence said. And I'm throwing this to the panel because that's the nature of the South African discourse. I'm not expressing a view either way. I'm throwing this because we've got such a distinguished panel.
Can I just say one thing? So the governor is basically highlighting a political problem. Basically, the reason why we're able to anchor the inflation target of 3 to 6% was the dominance of the ANC. We're able to force through the leadership of Thabo Mbeki, Trevor Manuel as Minister of Finance, and Boweni, and even the Senator himself. We're able to work together to have this. So in an environment of coalition, whereby it's even difficult to pass the budget, how do you then, to his question, how do you do that? How to anchor when you know that there's disloyalty, there is different policy preferences, and more importantly, in South Africa, the crisis is just deepened what we inherited in 1994.
Yes, I know there is, but this session proved to be not a dead session at all. So I'm going to come to the panel. So unfortunately, we can't take more questions. We can continue during the cocktail, which I'm going to speak to. I just want to get back to the panel to sort of respond to those two final sort of issues that the governor and Lumkile put on the table. So if I can start with Professor Hall.
Well, if you, and I'm sure you're right, have a huge amount of index-linked debt, then obviously reducing inflation is to the benefit of the fiscal authorities, hugely. And that probably completely offsets the normal inflation tax effects, which they would be losing under normal circumstances without that index-linked debt. So I think that's a very important point.
So, and I'm happy you talked about the inflation-linked bonds. If you look at the below-the-line items in the budget, the inflation-linked adjustments in the cost of bonds, there's also the exchange rate effect of the foreign-denominated bonds. All of that adds about 2 percentage points to, if you look at the difference between the change in debt as expressed as percentage of GDP and the deficit or headline number as percentage of GDP, there's always almost a 2 percentage point difference, depending now a bit on the exchange rate and so on. So, and that, most of that is explained by the adjustment in the inflation-linked bond value and the exchange rate effect. And that's also why just taking the interest rate that government pays and divided by the government bonds, the total outstanding debt, gives you too lower effective interest rate because it ignores this other 2 percentage point of GDP. So you're quite right. That is a big thing, and if one get that inflation number down, if you can get that exchange rate down, that will also shrink that difference between those items. As people know, I am a proponent of, I like the idea of a fiscal anchor, not because I inherently believe, or not because I believe it inherently limits a government, because a government that wants to break a fiscal ceiling or a rule will do so anyway. I mean, we thought Germany had a very strong debt break. They just voted to lift it. You know, so it's about political will. But I do think that it comes in handy if you want to signal your intention, if you want to signal that you want to maintain a sustainable fiscal policy. So I see it as a signaling device, and I think in that sense it augments the inflation target very well. What particular form one needs in terms of a fiscal, you know, what sort of fiscal anchor, whether it's a debt to GDP or a deficit to GDP or expenditure. I mean, there's a huge debate, and we don't have time to go into that. And I usually believe you need a bit of a combination of things. But the point there is it's a combination, and you need that political will. Look, it's the same is true for inflation target. If you don't want to keep it, no target set in any law will stop you from breaking it. But it's a transparency issue. It is a signaling device. It's the storytelling that Monique was talking about this morning.
Yeah, let's just say something about coalition. I come from Italy, therefore coalition was you are not used to it, but get used to it. One of the things about the coalition is that become more important the role of the bureaucracy and the institution as a guarantor of the continuity. Therefore, for example, if you go in Italy, there is not the state, or the president doesn't say the state of the nation. The only speech that is the state of the nation is done by the governor of the Bank of Italy, traditionally. Therefore, every year the governor of the Bank of Italy does a speech that is like a State of the Nation speech, but from the point of view of the only institution that everybody respected, because when you listen to the politician, the only one that mattered was the Bank of Italy. And the same, the bureaucracy at a place like the Treasury, or the fundamental bureaucracies that keep the system in a situation that there is always, contestation, but they keep the system thinking long term, become much more important. Because in a situation that you have total control, therefore, if you want, the issue here is that there was always this even in the formal structure, the sort of disconnection between the politics and the bureaucracy that was very compenetrated. But there is an element that you need to separate it more, and to have institutions that provide the long-term thinking that are on which then after you play the policy game. Because then the policy game may become, the issue about, for example, the fiscal, the policy game remain at the level where do we spend, who do we tax, etc. But somebody must have this long-term thing, is, what is the playing field in which this policy game is played. And I think this one, the coalition is not how politics should evolve. Is simply different interests that have to, therefore this is the politics going forward, but this one gives a much more responsibility to the bureaucracy of a state to provide the right information, the right analysis, and the independence that also constrain the policy game in which direction it goes. That's my...
Thank you very much to the panel.